What does it sound like when Rome is about to die? Not with a scream, but with bells in the half-light, oars brushing dark water, and prayers rising softly beneath a ceiling of gold. In just 53 days, the last surviving Roman Empire would be broken, and the city that had defied centuries would be forced to answer a terrible question. At dawn, Constantinople still looked eternal. The great dome of Hagia Sophia floated above the morning haze, like something suspended between earth and heaven. Along the ridges, churches and monasteries caught the first pale light. Sea walls met the Bosporus and the Marmara. Farther inland, the land walls stretched in long, stern lines of stone, those famous Theodosian defenses that had turned back armies for 1,000 years. And yet the city was no longer what it had been. Behind those mighty walls, wide spaces lay thinly peopled. Old forums had grown quiet. Palaces stood faded. Gardens and empty lots interrupted neighborhoods that had once been crowded with the noise of a capital at the center of the world. Constantinople was still magnificent, but it was a worn magnificence, candlelit and weathered, carrying itself with the dignity of a queen who had outlived her court. This was more than a city. It was New Rome, the last imperial capital of the Roman world, a fortress built not only of stone, but of memory, ritual, liturgy, law, and the unbroken habit of empire. Emperors had been crowned here. Relics had been guarded here. Diplomats, merchants, pilgrims, and conquerors had all measured themselves against these walls. Now, in the spring of 1453, the air seemed to settle into an uneasy stillness. Bells rang, waves folded against the shore. Somewhere in the distance, a voice called to prayer. History itself seemed to pause outside the gates, waiting. How could a city that had survived for 1,000 years fall in less than 2 months? To understand the siege, it helps to picture the city as if tracing it gently with a finger in the dark. Constantinople stood on a triangular peninsula, a wedge of land thrust between two bodies of water. To the north lay the Golden Horn, a deep, sheltered inlet that served as one of the finest natural harbors in the world. To the south, the Sea of Marmara opened toward the Aegean and the wider Mediterranean. And to the east, just beyond the city's tip, the Bosporus narrowed into a vital strait dividing Europe from Asia. This was the city's secret and its burden. Whoever held Constantinople did not simply possess a beautiful capital. They sat at a hinge of continents. Grain, silk, spices, timber, slaves, silver, soldiers, and ambassadors all moved through these waters. Fleets passed beneath its gaze. Trade could be taxed, watched, delayed, or denied. Messages between seas and empires flowed through this narrow throat. The city's geography also made it a fortress. On two sides, water guarded the approaches. Enemy fleets could threaten the harbors and seawalls, but the sea was also a shield. The real vulnerability lay on the western, landward side, where the peninsula joined the rest of Thrace. There, across roughly 4 miles, stood the Theodosian walls, a massive defensive system of moat, outer wall, inner wall, and towers, layered to absorb and break assault after assault. At the mouth of the Golden Horn, the Byzantines could stretch a great iron chain across the water, blocking hostile ships from entering the harbor. So even a city reduced in power remained difficult to trap completely. That is what made Constantinople so strange in its final years. It was isolated, yes, surrounded by stronger enemies and cut off from much of its former empire. But it was also still central, still dangerous, still important enough that no rising power could comfortably ignore it. Like a sleeping giant at the meeting point of worlds, the city rested in apparent stillness, while every road and current around it whispered that the storm would come here. By the middle of the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire was an empire mostly in memory. It had once been the eastern half of Rome, the state that endured when the Western Empire collapsed. From Constantinople, emperors had ruled over the Balkans, Greece, Anatolia, islands, ports, and rich provinces tied together by law, taxation, faith, and ceremony. For centuries, this empire survived disasters that should have ended it. Plague, Arab invasions, Bulgarian wars, internal rebellions, dynastic feuds, and the slow grinding pressure of enemies on every frontier. Then came deeper wounds. The Seljuk and later Ottoman advance into Anatolia stripped away the empire's heartland. Civil wars hollowed out what remained, and in 1204, the Fourth Crusade delivered a blow almost too bitter to describe, when Latin crusaders captured and sacked Constantinople itself. Though the Byzantines reclaimed the city in 1261, they never truly recovered the wealth, manpower, or stability they had lost. So by the early 1450s, what was left was painfully small. Constantinople, a few nearby territories, and the Despotate of the Morea in the Peloponnese, ruled by members of the imperial family. The emperor still bore the ancient Roman title, but his lands had shrunk to fragments, isolated and vulnerable. And yet the rituals endured. Court ceremonies still moved with deliberate grace. Priests still chanted in churches heavy with incense and lamplight. The emperor still appeared not merely as a ruler of territory, but as the guardian of a Christian Roman inheritance stretching back more than 1,000 years. That is what gave the city its sorrowful grandeur. Its people lived among monuments built for a stronger age. Great columns, forums, cisterns, and churches surrounded a population far smaller than the capital had once held. They walked through the architecture of memory itself. Constantinople was weak, yes, but weakness alone does not explain its power over the imagination. The city was carrying something heavier than armies and walls. It was carrying the accumulated weight of Rome, and it would be asked to bear that burden to the very end. In 1451, a young man took the Ottoman throne and fixed his gaze on Constantinople with a patience that should have frightened everyone. Mehmed II was only 19 when he became Sultan for the second time after the death of his father, Murad II. Youth in another prince might have suggested rashness or instability, but Mehmed was not drifting inside a dream of conquest. He was disciplined, educated, and intensely serious. He studied languages, he read history, he listened to discussions of statecraft, military science, and the lives of great rulers. He did not see kingship as ornament, he saw it as a test, and at the center of that test stood Constantinople. For generations, Ottoman rulers encircled the city, pressured it, besieged it, and failed to take it. Bayezid I had tried, Murad II had pressed hard. The city remained there, lodged between Ottoman territories in Europe and Asia, like an unfinished sentence. So long as it stood independent, it was an irritation, a symbol, and a strategic obstacle. It interrupted the clean unity of Ottoman power across the Straits. But to Mehmed, the city meant even more than that. Constantinople was prestige made stone. To capture it would not simply remove a rival enclave, it would announce that the Ottomans were heirs to imperial greatness on a world scale. The old Roman capital of the East, long defended by legend and walls, would become the centerpiece of a new empire. There is a quiet menace in that kind of ambition. Mehmed was not rushing toward a prize in a burst of youthful vanity. He was thinking, measuring, waiting. He understood that the city had resisted stronger men than he was. He also believed that history had left the door open for exactly one ruler bold enough and careful enough to force it, and once his mind settled on that possibility, it did not turn away. Mehmed did not begin with trumpets. He began with silence. After taking the throne in 1451, he moved first to secure himself. In a realm as large and demanding as the Ottoman state, a new sultan could not afford to appear uncertain. Rivals had to be watched. Frontiers had to be steadied. Allies and vassals had to hear calm words before they heard marching feet. So Mehmed projected control. He confirmed arrangements, reassured observers, and gave little outward sign of reckless urgency. That was part of the danger. Constantinople was safest when its enemies were distracted. Mehmed was not distracted. Behind the composed surface, preparations began to gather shape. Supply lines were considered. Troops and transport were weighed. Diplomatic contacts were managed with care. Messages went out and came back. Resources were counted not for a raid, not for a gesture, but for a campaign designed to finish what earlier Ottoman rulers had left undone. There were cautious voices around him. One of the most prominent was the Grand Vizier Halil Pasha, an experienced statesman who understood just how hazardous an assault on Constantinople could be. The city's walls were formidable. A failed siege could stain the Sultan's prestige and invite trouble elsewhere. Prudence had its arguments, and they were not foolish ones, but caution was being overtaken by method. Mehmed was not stumbling toward the city through pride alone. He was building the political and logistical conditions that would make a siege possible. He watched the Byzantines, he judged foreign powers, he measured how much resistance might truly come from the Latin West, and whether outrage would arrive faster than ships. In these early movements, almost nothing dramatic had happened yet. No breach, no cannon smoke, no charge against the walls, and still the machinery of conquest had begun to turn. That is often how great disasters approach. Quietly, under the cover of routine, while letters are sealed, stores are gathered, and one determined ruler decides that this time the old city will not be spared. What does it feel like to watch your executioner build the scaffold in daylight, stone by stone, across the water? In 1452, that was the view from Constantinople. On the European shore of the Bosporus, Sultan Mehmed II began raising a fortress so suddenly and with such force of purpose that it felt less like construction than a verdict. Rumeli Hisari climbed above the strait opposite the older Anadolu Hisari on the Asian side, the two strongholds facing one another like jaws. Between them ran one of the most important waterways on earth, and Mehmed intended to close his hand around it. The work moved with astonishing speed. Thousands of laborers, masons, and soldiers drove the project forward under direct imperial attention. Great towers rose, linked by thick curtain walls, their position chosen with cold precision at the narrowest point of the Bosporus. This was not simply a fort, it was an instrument, a measuring device, a claim written in stone that every ship passing between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean would now do so under Ottoman permission. From the city, the meaning was impossible to miss. Constantinople was not yet under formal siege, but the geometry of its future prison was already visible. The empire that had once commanded coasts, islands, provinces, and armies was now forced to watch as an enemy fortress took shape, almost within sight of its own churches and palaces. And there was something especially dreadful in that calm. No storming ladders, no battle cries, only the steady rhythm of labor, blocks lifted into place, mortar packed, towers sealed. The silence made it worse, because this was the siege before the siege, the tightening of distance, the enclosure of options, the patient drawing of a noose. By the time Rumeli Hisari stood complete, the message was unmistakable. Mehmed was not merely preparing to attack Constantinople. He was isolating it, studying it, and closing every path by which it might still breathe. Once, Rumeli Hisari stood over the Bosporus. The water no longer felt open. It felt watched. The strait that had long carried grain, merchants, envoys, and rumor now passed beneath Ottoman guns. Mehmed had turned geography into pressure. Any vessel moving through that narrow channel had to reckon with the fortress above, with artillery pointed downward, with officials who could demand obedience and enforce it. The Bosporus was still a sea lane, but it had become a gate, and the gate had a keeper. The warning was not theoretical. Ships that ignored Ottoman authority could be fired upon. The message spread quickly across the trading world. The route to Constantinople was no longer merely a matter of wind and tide, but of permission. For Genoese and Venetian merchants, for captains carrying food or goods, every crossing became a calculation. Profit had to be weighed against cannon shot, delay against danger, commerce against empire. Inside Constantinople, the consequences were heavier than numbers on ledgers. The city had always lived by movement, ships arriving, supplies unloading, news entering with the sails. Now all of that became uncertain. Aid from the Black Sea was harder to trust. Food was harder to secure. Confidence, too, began to thin. A city can endure hunger for a time. What truly weakens it is the sense that the world beyond its walls is slowly receding. And that is what Rumeli Hisari accomplished. It did not simply threaten the city. It taught everyone around it that Ottoman power had become the fact to be obeyed. The straits narrowed not only in physical terms, but in imagination. Fewer options, fewer guarantees, less time. So when the Great Siege finally opened in 1453, it did not begin with the first cannon. It began here, in this quieter suffocation, when the sea road tightened and Constantinople felt the first steady pressure of being cut away from the world. Inside the shrinking world of Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI, Palaiologos, did not behave like a man waiting for a miracle. He behaved like a man counting stones, gates, barrels, and hours. He understood the scale of what was coming. The empire he had inherited was no longer an empire in the old sense, but a capital, a few scattered possessions, and a memory vast enough to make the loss feel even larger. Constantinople itself was immense, far too large for the number of defenders available. Whole stretches of the city stood thinly populated. Ancient walls still ringed the landward side in monumental layers, but walls are only as strong as the hands that hold them. So Constantine moved through preparation with a practical calm. He inspected the Theodosian walls, the great triple line that had protected the city for centuries. He oversaw repairs where masonry had weakened, ordered ditches cleared, and worked to place men where an assault was most likely to come. Weapons were gathered, provisions were counted, resources were rationed carefully. There was no room for waste now, not in food, not in labor, not in hope, and yet he still had to be emperor. Ceremony did not disappear, it changed function. Ritual became a way of keeping the city emotionally intact, of reminding frightened people that authority still existed, that order had not collapsed. But Constantine's power no longer rested on treasure or overwhelming force. It rested on presence, on steadiness, on the visible fact that he would not leave. That may be the most moving thing about him in these final months. He seems to have lived without illusion. He could not summon great armies from across a flourishing realm. He could not command history to reverse itself. But he could prepare, endure, and stand in the name of what remained. And sometimes, at the edge of catastrophe, that is what sovereignty becomes. Not dominion, but refusal. As the danger closed in, Constantinople did what endangered states so often do. It looked outward, toward powers that might help, if only they could be persuaded to care in time. Appeals went westward across a Christian world that was, in theory, bound by faith, but in practice, divided by memory. The wounds ran deep. The sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade in 1204 had never faded from Byzantine consciousness. Latin promises were not easily trusted in a city that still remembered Western Christians as conquerors as well as brothers. And beyond that lay the long and bitter division between the Greek and Latin churches, a quarrel of doctrine, authority, and pride that had outlived generations. Yet necessity has a way of forcing old enemies into the same sentence. The Byzantines needed ships, soldiers, money, engineers, anything that could strengthen the walls and widen the city's chances. So envoys and letters carried the same fragile hope that shared Christian identity and the magnitude of the threat might overcome resentment. Some sympathy existed, some concern was real, but Europe in the mid-15th century was not a single will waiting to be awakened. Kingdoms had their own wars, rivalries, debts, and calculations. Distance mattered, time mattered, so did hesitation. To agree in principle is easy. To launch an effective rescue across seas in politics is something else entirely. What came back was limited, delayed, uneven. A few men, a few commitments, concern without decisive weight. There is something especially sad in this stage of the story, because it is so familiar in the history of collapsing states. Messages go out, replies come slowly. Allies discuss, negotiate, postpone. Everyone sees the danger, but not everyone feels it equally, and by the time they do, the moment for action has already narrowed. So Constantinople waited, listening for help beyond the horizon. Within Constantinople, even unity arrived with shadows attached. Help from the Latin West did come, but it entered a city where the memory of division was still alive in prayer, in language, in habit, in suspicion. Cardinal Isidore of Kiev stood as a representative of the attempted union between the Eastern and Western churches, a union proclaimed in hope and necessity, but accepted by many Byzantines only with deep reluctance. To some, reconciliation with Rome was a lifeline. To others, it felt like surrender dressed in liturgy. And yet the walls did not care about theology. The Ottoman threat forced enemies of yesterday into the same guarded rooms. Greek clergy, Latin clergy, soldiers from different ports and traditions, local citizens, foreign volunteers, all had to share the same city, the same danger, the same increasingly narrow future. Among the most important of these arrivals was the Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. He came with a small but highly skilled contingent, experienced in fortification and defense, and his presence mattered immediately. In a city short on trained fighting men, professionalism was priceless. Giustiniani was not a symbolic ally. He was a practical one, the kind of commander who could turn resolve into organized resistance. So Constantinople became, for a brief and fragile moment, a mixed garrison held together by necessity. The churches were not healed. The old arguments did not vanish. But under the pressure of approaching war, people who distrusted one another learned to stand on the same parapets. They prayed in different ways beneath the same domes. They listened for the same drums beyond the walls. There is a quiet poignancy in that uneasy union. History had stripped away the luxury of separation. Survival demanded cooperation, however imperfect, however temporary. And in that dim, watchful city, with candles burning before icons and foreign armor glinting in narrow streets, Constantinople began to gather itself into one last community because there was no other choice left. What if an empire could hear the sound of its own ending being poured in molten bronze? Before the walls of Constantinople were struck, they were already being challenged in fire. The man at the center of that change was a cannon founder known in the sources as Urban or Orban, a skilled engineer who had worked in the dangerous world where mathematics, metallurgy, and ambition met. He is said to have first offered his talents to the Byzantines, but the empire was poor, and its treasury could not support the scale of his vision. Mehmed could, and so, in Ottoman service, furnaces were stoked for a weapon large enough to make even the old walls seem suddenly mortal. Casting such bombards was not a simple act of manufacture. It was a trial of heat, timing, and nerve. Bronze had to be melted in enormous quantities, the molds prepared with precision, the cooling controlled so the gun would not crack under its own monstrous burden. A flaw hidden inside the metal could turn the weapon into a bomb for its own crew. Every stage demanded patience. Every success felt unnatural, as if human hands were trying to shape thunder. Then came the next problem: movement. These giant guns could not simply be lifted and carried to war. They had to be hauled over roads by teams of oxen, steadied by men with ropes, accompanied by carpenters, laborers, and engineers who reinforced bridges and leveled ground ahead of them. A single bombard moved with the slow dignity of a siege in miniature, and that was the quiet revelation. For centuries, the great stone walls of Constantinople had stood for permanence, for the old confidence that masonry and memory could outlast any assault. Now, across the foundries and roads of the Ottoman world, another age was taking shape. Ancient stones still stood, but modern explosive force was being forged, cooled, dragged forward, and aimed. By early April of 1453, the waiting ended. Mehmed II brought his army to Constantinople, and the land before the western walls began to disappear beneath men, animals, timber, wagons, and tents. It was not one single mass, but a vast and ordered gathering. There were regular troops drawn from across the empire, irregular fighters eager for plunder, disciplined janissaries held close as the Sultan's elite striking force, engineers measuring distances, artillery crews tending their guns, and laborers carrying tools for the slow work of siege. Roads filled with oxen dragging supplies, with carts of powder and shot, with bundles of stakes, coils of rope, and heavy beams for platforms and mantlets. Everywhere there was motion with a purpose. Campfires spread across the landward side in widening constellations. Banners lifted and settled in the spring wind. Commands traveled through the camp in many voices, but the effect was not chaos. It was concentration. A great mechanism was assembling itself before the city. Inside Constantinople, the contrast was stark and painfully clear. The defenders numbered only a few thousand effective fighting men, Byzantines and foreign allies together, trying to hold miles of walls, towers, gates, and intervals between. They had courage, experience, and the immense advantage of the Theodosian walls. What they did not have was depth. Every section assigned to one captain meant another section left thin. From the battlements, the city could see the imbalance settle into place, not as a sudden terror, but as something quieter and heavier. Fire by fire, tent by tent, battery by battery, the Ottoman presence spread until it seemed to rest against the horizon itself. Nothing important remained unfinished now. The army had arrived, the walls were manned, the artillery was in place, the long threat had become a visible fact, and with evening came the stillness that sometimes falls just before great violence begins. On April 6, 1453, the siege formally began. From that day forward, Constantinople was no longer a city awaiting attack. It was a city enclosed. Ottoman forces settled into their positions along the landward front. facing the great Theodosian walls that had protected the capital for centuries. Trenches were opened, batteries were laid out, earth was moved, timber planted, approaches measured. The work had a patient rhythm to it, almost domestic in its repetition, except that every spadeful of soil brought the enemy closer. To the north, the Golden Horn remained guarded by the great chain stretched across its mouth, fixed in place to deny hostile ships entry into the sheltered waters beside the city. It was a simple object, in one sense, iron links drawn across water. Yet it carried enormous weight in the minds of the defenders. So long as the chain held, one avenue remained closed. Along the walls, stations were assigned with care. Giovanni Giustiniani, the experienced Genoese commander, took responsibility for the most threatened sectors near the land walls, where the coming blows would likely fall hardest. Emperor Constantine XI moved among the defenses, not as a distant sovereign, but as a ruler sharing the hazard of the line. Watches were arranged, signals were agreed upon. Men learned where they were to stand, where to run, where to listen. And then the city entered a new kind of time. Bells, prayers, sentries changing posts, the opening and closing of gates under strict caution, the long hours of looking outward. Every sound carried meaning now. Every torch beyond the walls suggested labor in the dark. This was the threshold, not yet the crash of final assault, not yet the ruin to come, but the narrowing of all futures. The siege had started, and with it came the quiet, unmistakable knowledge that Constantinople had been drawn inside an ordeal from which it might not emerge unchanged. On April 12th, the cannons found their voice, and the siege changed its character. Until then, Constantinople had been surrounded. Now it began to be struck. The process was slow, almost ritualistic. Crews swabbed the barrel, measured the powder, rammed the charge, maneuvered the great stone ball into place, and withdrew with practiced caution. These were not weapons of rapid fire. They demanded labor, patience, and space. Then, after the long preparation, came the blast. The sound did not simply ring across the field. It rolled through the air and into the body, a deep concussion that shook ground, chest, and memory together. Smoke billowed outward. Birds lifted in sudden alarm. For a moment there was a strange pause, as if the world itself were listening for the result. Then the impact came against the Theodosian walls, stone shuddering, mortar bursting loose, dust rising in pale clouds, fragments skipping and falling through the battered face of defenses built in another age. The walls still held. They were immense, layered, and intelligently designed. But this was not the kind of punishment they had been made to endure forever. Again, the guns were loaded. Again, the thunder came. Through repetition, the bombardment became the pulse of the siege, a new heartbeat imposed from outside the city. Ancient masonry answered each strike with cracks, scars, and drifting dust. When evening softened the light, the defenders went out to inspect the damage. By torch and lantern, they filled broken places with earth, timber, stones, and rubble, trying to restore shape before dawn returned the artillery to its work. Day after day, the same contest unfolded, bronze against stone, powder against inheritance. It was more than a tactical exchange. It felt like the turning of an age. On those walls, the medieval confidence and passive strength was meeting the new insistence of gunpowder, and the old world was learning, one impact at a time, that endurance now had limits. Soon the siege settled into a weary rhythm, and survival became a matter of repetition. Day belonged to the guns, night belonged to the hands that tried to undo their work. At first light, the bombardment would begin again. The great cannons in smaller pieces spoke in intervals, not continuously, but often enough that no one could fully relax. There would be the blast, the trembling pause, a strike against stone, and then the drifting dust. Men watched the walls with narrowed eyes, learning to judge from the sound alone where damage had fallen. By afternoon, the face of the defenses might already look altered, as if the city were being slowly rewritten in cracks and debris. Then darkness came, and with it another labor. Defenders, sailors, townspeople, monks, laborers, noblemen, all were drawn into the same practical devotion. Earth was shoveled into gaps, timber was dragged into place, loose stones were stacked, wedged, and packed with rubble. Wherever a breach threatened to open, the city answered with whatever its people could carry. Torchlight shook across helmets, icons, carts, and tired faces powdered white with dust. Clergy moved among the workers with prayers and blessings, not because prayer replaced effort, but because effort needed prayer to continue. The emperor himself shared in the nightly urgency, and that mattered. In a city under siege, example could be as necessary as food. There was little glory in this work, no grand charge, no sweeping triumph, only fatigue that settled deep into the back and arms, and the knowledge that morning would erase much of what had just been repaired. Yet this was how Constantinople endured, not in a single dramatic gesture, but in 1,000 small refusals to give way. And in the narrow hours before dawn, when the hammers quieted and the last baskets of earth were emptied, a strange calm sometimes returned. The walls stood, patched once more. The city breathed, prayed, and waited for the thunder to begin again. What keeps a wall standing when the stones themselves are beginning to fail? Not the mortar, not the towers. A man. And in Constantinople, one of those men was Giustiniani Longo. He was not a figure of legend when he arrived, and that is precisely why he mattered. A Genoese captain from Chios, experienced, disciplined, and expensive, he came with a contingent of well-armed soldiers who understood siege warfare the way a surgeon understands blood. Emperor Constantine XI did not need romance, he needed competence. He needed someone who could look at a shattered section of wall, measure the danger without panic, and put men where they would hold. Giustiniani became that presence along the land walls, especially near the most threatened sectors around the Lycos Valley, where the Ottoman guns worried at the defenses day after day. There, the old Theodosian walls were still formidable, but they were no longer invulnerable. Stone cracked, earthwork slumped, dust drifted through the air. Every breach, every splintered barricade demanded immediate judgment, and Giustiniani gave it. He moved where the pressure was greatest, organizing repairs, directing sorties, placing his men with a professional eye for fields of fire and points of collapse. The defenders around him were not held together by speeches alone. They were held together by routine, by discipline, by the steady example of a commander who seemed to understand that a siege is won first in the nerves. Beside him stood Constantine, emperor of a dying empire, and between them there grew something more useful than ceremony: trust. Greek and Genoese, emperor and mercenary captain, they formed a practical alliance at the edge of ruin. It was not glorious, it was necessary, because in a siege, leadership is rarely a single heroic charge. More often it is the slower courage of staying calm while the walls tremble, of choosing correctly while men shout and stone falls, of making exhausted soldiers believe that this line, this broken line, can still be held until morning. For a little while, at least one boundary still obeyed the defenders. Across the mouth of the Golden Horn, the great chain remained in place, stretched from Constantinople to Galata like a line drawn against fate. It was a simple thing, in one sense. Iron links, floating supports, careful anchorage. But in war, simple things can carry immense weight. The Golden Horn was more than a harbor. It was the city's sheltered water, its northern shield, its guarded pocket of order. If Ottoman ships entered freely, the defenders would be exposed along another front, forced to spread men and energy even thinner. If the horn held, then not every door was open, not every wall had failed, and for now it held. Ottoman naval pressure was real, but it met resistance here. The boom denied easy passage, and within the harbor the smaller Christian and Byzantine vessels still had room to breathe, to maneuver, to exist without immediate ruin. Along the waterfront, that mattered deeply. Men who had spent their days listening to cannon on the landward side could look north and still see a barrier intact, a protected space, a working defense. That feeling was not triumph, it was something quieter and perhaps more precious. Steadiness. A brief sense that the city still possessed shape, that the siege had not yet dissolved every plan into chaos. The walls on land shook under bombardment, but the horn offered a different rhythm, a slower pulse, a reminder that skill and preparation still counted. Yet even here, beneath this pocket of confidence, another truth was taking form. Mehmed too was not a commander likely to sit patiently before an obstacle simply because it was old, or famous, or difficult. He had not come to Constantinople to admire its defenses, he had come to solve them, and while the chain glimmered across the water, secure for the moment, the Ottoman camp was already thinking in ways that did not respect the ordinary limits of a siege. Then, on April 20th, the sea offered the city a scene so improbable it almost felt like a dream. 4 ships appeared, coming through the Sea of Marmara toward Constantinople, and behind them lay the full attention of an empire trying to stop them. 3 were large Genoese transports carrying grain and supplies from the west. The 4th was an imperial Byzantine vessel. They were not a fleet that could change the war, they were too few for that, but from the walls, where every sail on the horizon had become a question of life or death, they looked like deliverance. The Ottoman navy moved to intercept. What followed unfolded in full view of both armies and of the people inside the city. The spring wind shifted. Great hulls leaned under straining canvas. Oars churned. Arrows rose in dark flights. Shot and missiles crossed the water. Smaller Ottoman vessels swarmed, trying to grapple and overwhelmed by numbers, while the heavier Christian ships used their height and mass to keep them off. Men watched from the battlements in breathless silence, then in cries, then in prayer. It became a contest not only of force, but of current, seamanship, and stubbornness. Again and again the ships seemed on the verge of being dragged under the Ottoman weight. Again and again they pushed forward. Their decks were crowded with fighters, their rigging shook, their sails bellied and snapped in the uncertain wind. And slowly, astonishingly, they broke through. By evening they entered the Golden Horn. Inside Constantinople, morale surged. Bells rang. Crowds rejoiced. For one night, hope was no longer an abstract virtue but something visible, something that had crossed the water under fire and survived. The city had seen proof that the blockade was not absolute, that courage and skill could still embarrass overwhelming power, but only for one night, because 4 ships, however brave, were still only 4 ships. Heroism had arrived at the harbor gates. It had not arrived in numbers large enough to lift the siege. The chain across the Golden Horn had done its work. It had stopped the Ottoman fleet at the water's edge. And then Mehmed answered with something so audacious that at first it must have seemed unreal. If the ships could not pass the barrier, they would simply go around it. On the night of April 21st and into April 22nd, the Ottoman camp began a feat of engineering that changed the mood of the siege in a single stroke. North of the Horn, along the slopes behind Galata, workers prepared a road of greased timbers and planks. Ropes were set, oxen were harnessed, men took their places in teams. Then, one by one, lighter Ottoman vessels were hauled out of the Bosporus and dragged overland. It was not magic. That is what makes it so unsettling. It was labor, planning, and method. Wood slicked with fat, rollers placed and replaced, hulls groaning as they moved over earth that should never have carried them. Orders passed in the dark, muscles straining, and obstacles studied, then outthought. By morning, the defenders could see the result with their own eyes. Ottoman ships were in the Golden Horn. The shock was profound because it was not merely tactical. It reached deeper than that. The chain had represented certainty, one of the few remaining certainties available to Constantinople. Now certainty itself had been breached. The harbor that had seemed protected was suddenly compromised, not by brute force alone, but by imagination. There is something eerie in moments like this. No great clash of armies, no immediate storming of walls, just the quiet arrival of a new reality. Vessels where no vessel should be. Enemy sails on waters the city had trusted. Mehmed had revealed something essential about the siege. Every fixed defense, no matter how ancient or admired, existed inside a contest of minds. Stone could be battered, chains could be bypassed, and a city that depended on old barriers now had to face a younger ruler who seemed determined to think past every one of them. Once Ottoman ships entered the Golden Horn, the city did not collapse in a single dramatic instant. It suffered something quieter, and in some ways worse. Its calculations became harder. Its margins became thinner. Its sense of safety began to drain away. Before this, the defenders had been able to treat the harbor as a guarded rear, imperfect but dependable. Now that confidence was gone. Men had to be shifted. Watches had to be strengthened along the seawalls facing the Horn. Resources already stretched to the limit had to be divided again. Every commander understood the danger immediately. The Ottomans did not need to win at once on this front. They only needed to force Constantinople to think about it, to spend strength on it, to lose sleep over it. That is how a siege tightens. Not always through one crushing blow, but through multiplication. Another threat, another repair, another place where men must stand through the night. The land walls still demanded constant labor under bombardment. Yet now the northern defenses could no longer be treated as secure. The city was being made to defend itself everywhere, all the time. For leaders like Lucas Notaras, the Grand Duke, this meant impossible arithmetic. Ships, stores, crews, morale, patrols, rumors, repairs, every choice consumed something that could not easily be replaced. To strengthen one point was to weaken another. To reassure the population required confidence that few could honestly feel. Even success became exhausting. And still the Ottomans pressed, not recklessly but with a calm, accumulating pressure. The new presence in the Horn altered the psychology of the siege as much as its strategy. A trusted barrier had failed, and once that happens, every other defense begins to look a little more vulnerable, a little more temporary. Constantinople was not yet broken. Its walls still stood, its commanders still worked, its emperor still refused to spare. But the shape of the struggle had changed. The city was now living inside a narrowing circle, and each Ottoman innovation drew that circle tighter, one measured turn at a time. What does a city sound like when it believes the end may be near? Not only the crash of cannon, but the soft answer of prayer, candles trembling in the dark, old voices rising beneath a wounded sky. Inside Constantinople, faith became a kind of second wall. When stone cracked and sleep vanished, people turned to procession, liturgy, and relics, with a tenderness that was also defiance. Priests carried icons through the streets. Hymns drifted along alleys crowded with the anxious and the exhausted. In homes and monasteries along the ramparts themselves, prayers were repeated until they became breath, and breath became endurance. At the heart of this inner life stood Hagia Sophia, vast, shadowed, and luminous in lamplight. It was more than the empire's great church. It was memory made visible. Beneath its dome, generations had been baptized, married, crowned, and mourned. Now, as the siege tightened, the building gathered fear and hope into one immense silence. To enter it was to step, however briefly, outside the panic of the hour and into the continuity of 1,000 years. The city had also been marked by bitter religious division. The union proclaimed between the Greek and Latin churches remained deeply unpopular among many Byzantines even in this final crisis. Yet siege as a way of narrowing the distance between argument and survival. Services continued. Relics were venerated. The Virgin, long believed to be the protector of Constantinople, was invoked again and again. Beyond the walls, the Ottoman camp was animated by its own conviction. Mehmed's army fought for empire, for glory, and for a victory understood in sacred as well as political terms. There, too, prayer steadied men before danger. So the nights filled with devotions on both sides, not because faith erased terror, but because it gave terror a form people could carry. In that trembling light, ritual did not stop the siege. It taught the living how to endure it. The walls did not fail all at once. They began instead to tire. Day after day, the land walls of Constantinople absorbed punishment that would have ruined lesser defenses in a fraction of the time. The Theodosian walls, layered and deep, still showed the genius of their design. Outer wall, terrace, inner wall, towers placed to command the approaches. Even under Mehmed's artillery, they remained formidable. A breach opened, and the defenders filled it with earth, timber, barrels, rubble, anything that could become resistance by nightfall. But every repair was a confession. The city was spending itself. The great bombards and smaller guns kept striking. Stone splintered. Mortar loosened. Towers shuddered under repeated impact. What cannon did not destroy outright, constant labor slowly unmade. Men hauled debris in darkness, worked with bleeding hands, then took their places again at dawn. The same faces appeared everywhere, on the parapets, in the breach, beside the wounded, then back with shovels and baskets before they had truly rested. And sleep began to disappear. That was one of Mehmed's most effective weapons. Not only iron, but recurrence. Bombardment by day, alarms by night, skirmishes at weak points, sudden pressure where the masonry looked most fragile. The defenders could never be certain whether a small attack was a distraction, a test, or the beginning of something much worse. By mid-May, the walls around the Lycus Valley, especially near the gate of St. Romanus, had become zones of constant strain. Giustiniani and his men, central to the defense there, helped organize repairs and resistance with relentless discipline. But courage could not restore stone to its original strength. The city was still standing. That mattered. Yet the character of the siege was changing. Constantinople was not being shattered in one dramatic blow, it was being worn thinner, day by day, hour by hour, until even survival began to feel brittle. The walls still held, the men upon them were beginning to fray. Then the war went underground. From around May 16th onward, another struggle began beneath the battered earth in front of the walls, hidden from the towers and almost invisible to history, unless one listens very closely. Ottoman engineers, drawing on experience and specialist knowledge, began driving mines beneath the defenses, hoping to collapse sections of wall from below. If the stone above could not be broken quickly enough, perhaps the ground itself could be turned against the city. So beneath the noise of artillery, men started listening for a different sound. Inside Constantinople, the defenders organized countermine operations under experienced hands, among them the German engineer Johannes Grant, who is credited in the sources with helping detect and disrupt the tunnels. Ears were pressed to the soil, buckets of water were set still, watching for the faintest tremor. In the dark below, the siege became intimate, almost unbearable in its closeness. The tunnels were narrow, hot, and starved of air. Men crawled where they could not stand. Torchlights smoked against packed earth. Tools struck dirt in muffled rhythm, and every scrape might mean the enemy was only a few feet away, digging toward you through the same black silence. Sometimes the Byzantines broke into Ottoman galleries and fought underground, face to face in choking darkness. Sometimes they flooded or burned the tunnels. Sometimes they collapsed them, burying the men inside. It was a brutal, hidden contest of nerve and timing, with no room for formation or spectacle, only breath, flame, and panic. Above ground, the city watched the walls. Below ground, the foundations of survival were being contested by miners who would never see the sky while they worked. It is one of the strangest truths of the siege. Constantinople was being attacked in every dimension at once. Over the battlements, across the Golden Horn, and now under the soil, where the empire's fate trembled in stale air, in whispered warnings, in the sudden collapse of earth. By the final third of the siege, the knights had developed a pattern no one could trust and no one could escape. An alarm would rise in darkness, bells, shouts, the hurried clatter of men pulling on armor they had barely removed. Somewhere along the line, Ottoman troops were moving again, perhaps toward a damaged section of wall, perhaps toward a gate, perhaps only to measure the defender's speed and weakness. Men ran through torchlit streets toward the threatened sector, half awake, already exhausted, carrying spears, bows, shields, or stones for the breach. These were not yet the last great storming attacks. They were probes, escalations, rehearsals in blood. Mehmed's forces kept pressing, searching for softness in the defenses, testing whether fear and fatigue had finally opened what artillery alone could not. The defenders answered each threat as if it might be the decisive one, because one night, inevitably, it would be. Again and again they held. At the walls, missiles flew in darkness. Small groups clashed at ditches and broken works. Ladders were raised and thrown down. In some sectors, attackers briefly gained ground before being driven back. In others, they found repairs stronger than expected. Yet every successful defense consumed something the city could not replace: another wounded veteran, another store of arrows, another night's sleep, another measure of steadiness. Then dawn would come, pale and almost gentle, and reveal what the dark had hidden: bodies in the ditch, fresh damage in the earthworks, splintered mantlets, blood on stone, and beyond all that, the Ottoman camp still vast, still organized, still preparing for another day of bombardment. So the rhythm continued. Cannon by daylight, repairs at dusk, alarm in the night, brief relief at sunrise, if relief was even the word. Constantinople remained unconquered, but the meaning of victory had narrowed terribly. It no longer meant breaking the siege. It meant lasting one more night, and then somehow enduring the next. Near the end, even as the guns continued, words still moved between the camps. Mehmed too offered terms. If the city surrendered, lives might be spared and the emperor allowed to depart. According to later accounts of the exchanges, it was the kind of message that arrives heavy with mercy on the surface and certainty underneath. Submit, and the destruction may be limited. Refuse, and what follows will belong to conquest. Inside Constantinople, this was not a simple choice, because by now almost nothing was simple. The city was exhausted. The walls were damaged. Aid from the West had not come in the force once hoped for. Food, sleep, and confidence had all grown thin. And yet surrender was not merely a practical question. It was dynastic, spiritual, civilizational. What did it mean for the Roman emperor to abandon the city entrusted to him? What did survival mean if purchased by yielding the capital of an empire that had endured for more than 1,000 years? Constantine XI carried that burden in full view of men who could offer counsel, but not escape the truth for him. Around him, rumor would have moved like wind through narrow streets. Perhaps terms would soften, perhaps relief would appear, perhaps the enemy too was tiring, perhaps one more week might change everything. But hope had become a whisper, not a plan. There were also divisions in the Ottoman camp. Halil Pasha, the Grand Vizier, is often remembered in the sources as more cautious, less eager to gamble everything on prolonged assault. Mehmed was not. He had committed too much, and his ambition ran beyond compromise. For him, negotiation at this stage was less a search for mutual settlement than a final test of the city's resolve. The answer that came back was, in essence, refusal. Constantinople would endure what it could not reasonably expect to survive, and that may be the most haunting moment of all. Not the collapse, not the shouting, not the breach, but the quiet instant when everyone could feel the odds, and still the city chose to remain itself to the end. What does a city sound like when it knows it may not survive the morning? On the final night of Constantinople, the answer was not screaming, not steel, but prayer. Inside Hagia Sophia, beneath that vast and shadowed dome, the people of the city gathered for what would be remembered as the last great liturgy of Christian Constantinople. The empire had been reduced to these walls, these streets, these exhausted defenders. And now, with the Ottoman guns still waiting in the darkness beyond, old arguments suddenly seemed very small. Men and women who had spent years divided by doctrine, by politics, by bitterness over union with the Latin Church, stood together in the same flickering light. For a few quiet hours, the siege pressed them into a single human truth. The church itself must have felt like a world apart. Lamps glowed softly against marble, incense drifted upward. Voices rose and settled beneath the dome that had watched emperors crowned, victory celebrated, and generations buried. Outside, the city was wounded. Inside, time seemed to slow. Somewhere among the worshippers moved Constantine XI, the last emperor of the Romans. Not on a throne, not at a distance. He went among his officers, his companions, his people, asking forgiveness for any wrong he had done, and giving thanks for their loyalty. It is one of those small, piercing details history preserves with unusual tenderness. At the end, ceremony gave way to humility. There was no strategy left to discuss here, no new plan to save the walls. Only the knowledge, heavy and almost serene, that dawn might close the long story of an empire that had endured for more than 1,000 years. And so they prayed in the stillness, while outside the enemy prepared, and the night held, for a little longer, the last breath before destruction. Before dawn on May 29th, the siege entered its final shape. Nothing about the coming assault was improvised. Mehmed II had spent weeks tightening the ring around Constantinople, battering its land walls, probing its weak points, exhausting the men who defended them. Now he prepared to break the city by sequence, by pressure, by relentless design. In the Ottoman camp, the hours before sunrise were marked by movement, prayer, and command. Drums sounded through the dark, orders passed down the lines. Thousands of men waited in ranks that had been arranged, not for one sudden blow, but for repeated impact. The plan was brutally clear. First would come irregular troops, the Bashi bazooks, thrown forward to harass, confuse, and drain the defenders. After them, more disciplined Anatolian forces would press the struggle harder, widening weakness where they found it. Then, at the decisive moment, Mehmed would commit his best troops, including the Janissaries, against a defense already worn thin. Inside the city, the defenders took their stations once more. There were perhaps only a few thousand effective fighting men left along the great land walls, including Byzantine soldiers, Genoese under Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, and other small foreign contingents. They had endured bombardment, repairs by torchlight, alarms in the dark, and the slow punishment of sleeplessness. By now, fatigue was not a feeling, it was part of the body. At the vulnerable section near the gate of St. Romanus, where the cannon had done their worst, men waited behind patched earthworks and broken masonry. Somewhere behind them stood Constantine XI, still refusing any thought of escape, The chain across the Golden Horn still held, but it no longer mattered enough. The struggle would be decided here, at the land walls, in these last hours before sunrise. Everything that had been gathering for 53 days now moved toward one point. The guns had spoken, the trenches had crept closer, the ships had crossed the hill, and in the darkness before morning, the final tide began to come in. The assault began in waves, just as Mehmed had planned. First came the irregulars, hurled at the walls in great numbers. They were not expected to win the city themselves. Their task was to consume strength, to force the defenders to strike, lift, drag, and kill until their arms grew heavy and their reactions dulled. The Byzantines and their allies drove them back, but every repulse cost something. Then the pressure deepened. Anatolian troops advanced into the torn ground before the walls, pressing toward the breaches opened by artillery near the gate of St. Romanus. In the half-light before dawn, smoke, dust, shouting, and the crash of weapons blurred the field. The defenders still held, but the line was no longer firm in the old sense. It was a living edge, bending, sealing, breaking, and reforming under strain. Then came a blow from which the defense may never have recovered. Giustiniani Longo, the Genoese commander whose discipline and experience had been crucial throughout the siege, was badly wounded. Sources differ on the exact nature of the wound, but they agree on its effect. He was carried from the walls. At the worst possible moment, men saw one of their strongest leaders leaving the fight. Morale faltered. In a siege this tight, that kind of shock could spread faster than fire. Now Mehmed sent in the Janissaries. Fresh, disciplined, and driving hard at a defense already fraying, they forced the crisis to its limit. Somewhere amid the collapsing struggle, the emperor made his final choice. Constantine XI refused to flee. According to later tradition, he cast off the signs of imperial rank and entered the fighting as one soldier among many. After that, he disappears into the chaos. The breaches widened, positions were overrun, Ottoman troops gained entry, and the defense unraveled street by street. By morning, Constantinople was lost. The last Byzantine emperor was gone, and with him vanished the empire that had called itself Roman for more than 1,000 years. When the fighting ended on May 29th, Constantinople passed from desperate defense into the brutal logic of conquest. Ottoman troops moved through the city, claiming the rewards traditionally granted after a successful storming. There was killing, plunder, terror, and the seizure of captives. Churches and houses were broken open. Families were scattered. For the people inside the walls, the mourning brought not a single ending, but thousands of private ones. And yet, even in those first hard hours, Mehmed II was already thinking beyond destruction. He was 21 years old, and he had taken the city that generations of Muslim rulers had failed to capture. But he did not want a ruin. He wanted a capital. When Mehmed entered Constantinople, he came not simply as a conqueror intoxicated by victory, but as a ruler claiming inheritance. The city still possessed what no other city in the region could offer: unmatched prestige, imperial memory, strategic command of the Bosporus, and the symbolic authority of Rome's old eastern seat. To possess it was one thing. To remake it as the center of a new empire was something larger. Hagia Sophia became the clearest sign of that transformation. The great church, so recently filled with the final prayers of Byzantium, was converted into a mosque. The act was unmistakably a rupture, but it was also a declaration of continuity. Mehmed was not erasing the importance of the city. He was taking hold of it, recasting its sacred and political heart in Ottoman form. Soon he would begin repopulating the city, restoring its functions, and establishing it as the imperial center of his expanding state. So the conquest of Constantinople was not only the fall of one world, it was the deliberate founding of another. Out of grief, smoke, and silence, a new capital was already beginning to rise. So this is how a 1,000-year empire ended, not in a single flash, and not only because one army was stronger on one morning, but because the world around Constantinople had been changing for generations. The Byzantine Empire that fell in 1453 was the last direct continuation of Rome, heir to emperors, law, liturgy, and memory stretching back through more than a millennium. Yet by the final siege, that inheritance rested on diminished territory, fragile finances, and uncertain allies. Appeals to the Latin West had brought sympathy, promises, and some brave individuals, but not the unified rescue the city needed. Old divisions remained even as the walls shook. At the same time, warfare itself had changed. The Theodosian walls had defied enemies for centuries, but gunpowder artillery altered the terms of survival. Mehmed's cannon did not make fortifications meaningless, but they made ancient confidence impossible. Engineering, logistics, naval maneuver, and sustained bombardment now worked together in new ways. The old capital faced not just a rival empire, but a different military age. And still, amid all of that change, human rituals endured. The prayers in Hagia Sophia, the emperor asking forgiveness, the defenders returning again and again to broken ramparts by torchlight. These were not footnotes. They were the final expressions of a civilization meeting its end with ceremony, fatigue, courage, and grief. Mehmed understood something equally important. To conquer Constantinople was not merely to destroy a famous city. It was to seize a hinge of the world and make it the heart of Ottoman power. In that sense, the story does not close with collapse alone. It turns. The waters of the Bosporus still moved as they always had. The domes and walls still stood against the same sky. But the empire beneath that skyline had changed. Byzantium had become the Ottoman imperial city, and in time, Istanbul. A 1,000-year empire fell in 53 days because its walls, its alliances, and its world had all been changing long before the final assault began.